Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. Today we're focused on wind energy, which is a really important source of energy here in Wyoming and across the nation and the world. Of course, we're always focused on the Wyoming energy sector here at the School of Energy Resources. So today we have the directors of the School of Energy Resources Wind Energy Research Center. And as you've heard in previous podcasts, our research centers of excellence really bring together faculty, often from many departments, certainly more than one faculty member, working together around a common topic. And so today we'll be focused on wind. So welcome, Jonathan and Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So can you please introduce yourself and give a little bit of your background and how you came to work at the University of Wyoming College of Engineering and Physical Sciences? Who wants to start?
All right, I'll go first. All right, my name is Michael Stoellinger. I'm currently an associate professor in mechanical engineering. I actually have quite a history of UW. I got my master's at the Technical University of Munich, but in my last year I came here as an exchange student, then got offered to stay as a PhD student. Got my PhD in 2010, then worked for 2 years at the Delft University of Technology as a postdoctoral researcher, and started at UW as a faculty member in 2012. Early on, I started working mostly on modeling combustion processes via computational fluid dynamics, which we'll abbreviate with CFD here. And then started kind of expanding my CFD work into aerodynamics and also atmospheric flows. The common theme there is really turbulence modeling. So turbulence is a chaotic state that is observed in fast-flowing rivers, for example. And although we do know the equations that describe the state of flow, we don't know any mathematical solutions. So we often have to approximately solve the equations using large computers. But the problem is so big that, for example, just to study the flow of wind over a flat piece of land 3 by 2 miles wide would take about 3,000 years on the currently fastest supercomputer at Oak Ridge. So this is a real big computational problem.
So, Michael, did you know, by the way, that I also got my PhD studying turbulence using CFD?
Yeah.
It's totally irrelevant for this conversation, but I don't know if we made that connection. Okay, Jonathan, how about you?
My name's Jonathan Naughton. I'm a professor in mechanical engineering, same department as Michael. I got here a little earlier than Michael did, And before I got here, I did my bachelor's in the East Coast at Cornell University, then did my PhD at Penn State University with a little break in between actually working in the aircraft industry. After getting my PhD, I spent 4.5 years at NASA Ames Research Center in the Bay Area in California, doing essentially experimental aerodynamics in support of computational fluid mechanics, dynamics. So they actually use the experiments we use often to validate the codes can actually calculate the complex flows we're trying to calculate. After that, I came here to the University of Wyoming in 1997, and I adapted my research areas a little bit and broadened out. Wind energy was one of the first things I broadened out into, but also rotorcraft, all kind of wrapping around this unsteady aero. And we basically develop instrumentation and conduct experiments that allow us to measure very difficult quantities sometimes that can help us better understand those flows, but also to provide data for modelers so that they can improve their codes.
Great. And you are so in the right place to work on wind energy, exactly. As we all know. So, but what made you interested to kind of go down the road and make that more of a focus of your research? And then follow up, what made you think about starting the Wind Energy Research Center?
Sure. Great question. So when I got to Wyoming, looking around trying to find applications of unsteady aerodynamics, I looked around, and at that time, wind energy was kind of in its, we'll call it renaissance. Obviously, we had a first real large look at wind energy in the 70s, but that kind of petered out after oil prices came down in the 80s. But then in the mid to late 90s, it was kind of a renaissance of wind energy, looking at how it could, come into the modern era and produce fair amounts of electricity for the grid. So coming to Wyoming, this seemed like a good area to get into, in proximity to some of the laboratories that actually work in this area, the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado and Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico, both being big labs in this area. It was good to be in their backyards. And our first grant, my first grant in wind energy, was in 2002. So we got into it and have been doing it since.
Sure. And what about the center? What made you want to stand that up?
Great. So in the mid 2000s, again, wind was starting to grow. There was a lot of interest in wind, and several of the departments within at that time, the College of Engineering, so civil engineering, mechanical, electrical engineering, and atmospheric science, we had people that were working in areas related to wind energy, but we'd never kind of worked together very much. And so they kind of put together a couple of white papers on how a group of us could come and start to address some of the interdisciplinary topics that were starting to arise. Things like how do atmosphere and these large wind machines work together was an area in particular where we started. And those white papers were well received, but there was really no, financial resources to really jumpstart it. And then in 2008, BP at the time donated a $5 million gift to the university. And to many people's surprise, including ours, they designated $2 million of that to go towards wind energy. At which point we had the structure started, and we stood up the center. And just as a minor note, that was about the same time that the School of Energy Resources started up.
Yeah.
So we're just about the same age.
Yep. Started in Stackshoe in 2006, but obviously it took a few years to get going.
Yep.
Cool. So, and you've been, as you clearly, in the wind energy research sector for a long time. Can you talk about some of the most notable changes you've seen during that time?
Sure. I think the couple that I've seen that are really notable is how fast wind energy has grown as a source of electricity in the United States. So, for example, in 2000, it was approximately just less than 0.2% of our electricity.
Nationally?
Nationally, yes. And then in 2023, it was just over 10.5%. So, in terms of the electrical industry, that's a very short period of time to have that much growth in any of the sectors. So I think that's been one of them. And related to that, I think two other things that kind of go along with that story doesn't happen in isolation. One is the size of the turbines have grown dramatically. So again, an example, one of our first wind farms in Wyoming was out at Arlington at the Foot Creek wind site. And the first machines out there were 600 kilowatt machines, or 0.6 megawatt, with about a 35 meter long blade. And they were replaced. I think there were 60 of them out there on the ridge, approximately 60. And they were replaced with 14 larger turbines just recently that are 4.1 megawatt size, right? So much, much larger, with blade diameters that are 138 meters, so much, much larger machines. So just that has been huge, the increase in the size. And related to those two things is the drop in the cost of electricity from wind energy.
There's a lot that's happened over the last 25 years. Okay, so let's talk about your specific research, Dr. Stoellinger. Let's start with you. So can you talk about, at a high level, some specific areas that you're looking at now related to wind energy research?
Yeah, I'm definitely still working on the computational side of modeling these problems. In particular, we are working on developing models to better predict the power output of whole wind farms. And by wind farm, we always mean a collection of individual wind turbines over, let's say, a typical year, which means, you have different seasons, different strengths of winds, different states of the atmosphere. So in summer you have the convective state where the warm ground heats the atmosphere and creates this convective currents. In winter it's very stable. So you see that in Laramie, if you drive by the power plant, you see in winter very often that the smokestack or the exhaust there rises very steadily. And so that means there is not much motion in the atmosphere. So, and by predicting these power outputs better, we mean more accurately and at lower computational cost, so faster. And the overall goal, obviously, the predicted power output of a wind farm is a very important. That's the major source of income. And so reducing the uncertainty on that number is very important for projects to get financing, or the details of the financing they can get. So not only knowing how much, but also how sure you can be, how close you think the actual power production will be to that number is important.
So you're like estimating like an average over each year?
Exactly.
Really?
And for that you need to divide it, right?
Yeah.
The wind blows from different regions that many times at that strength. And so you can imagine there's a lot of different cases that you need to study, and that hence you want to be able to get these numbers quick so you can study more of the cases. So that's kind of the back and forth. And along the way, obviously, you'll work with different fidelity models. So higher fidelity, maybe mostly used to validate the lower fidelity models that then are actually used to produce these power production estimates.
Interesting. How about you, Dr. Naughton?
So my work largely supports what Michael does. Again, most of the work I do is experimental, and what we're trying to do is use experiments to better understand some of the processes that go into determining things like how much power a wind plant's going to produce, or even an individual wind turbine. So we do experiments everywhere from wind tunnels, where we'll do simple experiments, say of wind turbine blades, to testing on full-scale wind turbines and even wind farms. Obviously, when we test on full-scale wind turbines and wind farms, we're actually partnering with places like the Department of Energy's labs, so National Renewable Energy Lab and Sandia National Labs, Pacific Northwest Labs. These are always done as conjunctions because they're very, very large projects. And really, again, we're trying to both understand better the phenomena that happens. So, for instance, on a wind turbine blade, what the flow is doing under highly turbulent conditions when the atmosphere is warming from the earth during the day, and how it differs at night, say when the wind's very steady, but very, very high changes in velocity with height. So different phenomena happen. We try and understand that, as well as the wake from one turbine is going to impact other turbines downstream. So understanding those processes, they govern the wake.
So like kind of so you can optimize how you build the turbines.
Build them, place them.
Or place them, I should say.
And even control them. Now we're actually looking at not controlling individual turbines, but controlling the turbines as a fleet to best provide and maximize energy production while trying to keep the loads reasonable on the turbines so you don't cause damage. And then one of the latest things going on is looking at even how one plant is affecting the downstream plant. So what does that wake from all those turbines look like as it propagates downstream? So we try and take measurements in the atmosphere, in wind plants, on wind turbines, and as I said, in the wind tunnel, to try and address those issues and provide data for the models so the models can get better.
Great. And I will say, in addition to all this incredible research, you're also educating students here at the University of Wyoming. And one of those students, Sarah Buckhold, we hired, and she's an employee here now at the School of Energy Resources. And I asked Sarah, could you build and design a wind power plant that would make the wind speed slower at my house? And how much would that study cost? And when can you do it? And she actually thinks that you could make it slower.
Yeah, you might be closer to that wind plant than you wish you were.
Yeah, that's true. You don't want it right in your front yard, but it's so windy here. Well, anyway, that's too bad that we can't reduce the wind speed in Laramie, but there's other advantages to wind energy. So let's talk about those. But first, what about challenges? What challenges are you contributing to solve?
Yeah. So let's put this a little bit in perspective. So in 2015, the DOE, Department of Energy, published a report, Wind Vision, that kind of laid out different scenarios on how we want to grow the wind industry such that more and more electricity is provided by wind energy. And the goals were 10% of nation's electricity supplied by wind in 2020, 20% in 2030, and then 35% in 2050. So it's obviously a large growth. Jonathan already mentioned in 2022, we kind of reached this 10% goal. So we are somewhat on track, but it's going to get harder and harder once we scale up. So in view of that, I think one major issue is grid connection and supply chain constraints. So in particular, the typical grid connection time, so for a planned wind turbine to get connected to the grids is anywhere from 3 to 5, maybe even 10 years. So that delays projects a long time. Land use and environmental concerns, siting conflicts, wildlife impact, community opposition, obviously also a challenge. Scaling offshore wind, so especially overcoming high costs and complex installations. And then deep water technology development, so floating offshore wind farms, a challenge. Workforce and skilled labor shortages. So obviously, as the industry grows, we need more and more people at various levels to design, plan, build, and maintain these wind farms. Grid integration and energy storage, so managing the variability, ensuring grid stability as wind power increases, so that at 1% was not an issue, but once we get to 20, 30%, that becomes certainly an issue. And obviously increasing wind farm efficiency and optimal wind farm control, what Jonathan already mentioned, kind of thinking bigger picture, so how can we control turbines in one wind farm or even multiple wind farms to kind of mitigate some of the issues that I've mentioned. And so we are working on, we help the workforce education, right, through our component as being teaching at the mechanical engineering department. We work on grid integration, energy storage. For example, Sarah Buckle that you mentioned, she has part of her dissertation was looking into stranded wind in Wyoming. That means regions that have very high wind resources but are not going to be connected to the grid anytime soon. So is there something we can do there? And also the increasing wind farm efficiency, optimal wind farm control. So we work on blade aerodynamics, high fidelity simulations, also digital twin and AI work that's going on in a new project.
Okay, so that's a lot of challenges. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think
that was a good list.
Michael did a great job. It's enough projects, but that's one of the things I just would say is you can take a look at it. A lot of times we drive by these wind plants and we say it's a done technology, right? Everything's perfect, but we're still learning a lot, and there's a lot still to be done. And there are actually a couple of articles over the last 4 or 5 years, one in Science, one in Wind, and another in the Wind Energy Science Journal, pointing out that the research is still really important because it has the impacts on all the things we've talked about, right? Being able to have the better models to allow us to better predict and use and get financing costs down. So everything to try and get wind to grow faster.
Sure. So let's just unpack a few of those, like some of the challenges around wind, and maybe address issues. Some might be misconceptions, some not. So let's go through a couple of those. The one that didn't really get mentioned, I think, was the blades post-use. So after these like mini power plants, if you think of each turbine as a power plant, I guess the whole thing is a power plant. But there have been claims that the turbines aren't the blades aren't recyclable and they produce a lot of waste. Now, I would point our listeners to look at the Wyoming Energy Authority recently has done a lot of work on this very topic with industry, and they've found a very creative solution. And I think industry's been working on this for a while. They just needed permission. The idea is to use used wind turbine blades for backfill in reclamation of mining projects. So that's one potential use. But from your point of view, how do you see, so that might work here in Wyoming. We have some of the world's biggest mines. But do you see any other approaches or any other work that needs to be done impacting wind energy and like this recycling or life cycle issue?
Yeah, I left that one out as a challenge because...
Well, the only one.
I hope after... answering this question, maybe it becomes more clear why it's maybe not such a big issue. So first of all, let's look at land-based turbine materials by mass. It's 87% metals and 10% is the blade material. The blade material consists usually of glass fiber or a little bit of carbon fiber, but obviously carbon fiber expensive, so mostly is glass fiber. And then the resin, like epoxy, that holds it together, and some other plastics. Obviously, 87% is the majority by mass, and metal recycling is nothing new. That is very straightforward to do. So what to do with the remaining material, which is the blade mass? So these composites, fiberglass, carbon fiber with epoxy, high tensile strength fibers that form what we call glass or carbon fiber reinforced polymers. They are very similar to recreational boat hulls. That's where these materials are applied in large quantities too. So the epoxy resin is what's called a thermoset, which means it is irreversibly cured or hardened. So you mix the resin with a hardener, and then it hardens, and as the name implies, irreversible, you cannot just soften it again. It will stay in that state. And they are very stable material. That's why we use them in these plates, right? And they indeed cannot be easily recycled because it's hard to separate the epoxy from the glass fiber again, right? Once it's hardened, it stays like that. On the other hand, so that is a problem, but on the other hand, that makes it a very inert material, so it really doesn't exude any toxic substances when buried. So this is actually quite an as ideal a material for landfill as you can have. So that's kind of important. So in the US, we expect an accumulative mass of around 3 million tons of end-of-life blade material by 2050. So first want to focus on kind of going forward. Obviously, even if we change the blade material now, there's still a lot of material that might need to be end stored, right? So a recent study by NREL looked into that, and they estimate the landfill capacity in 2050. The blade material would only comprise about 1% of the landfill volume, the available volume, and 0.02 by mass. So even in that point of view, it really is not much of an issue. You can make that number even better by assuming that you grind up the blades to very smaller pieces, so then the same mass occupies much less volume. And then, as you mentioned, Holly, legally and technically, wind turbine blade materials can be used now to backfill surface coal mines, for example, in Wyoming, to help speed up the reclamation process. And mines are also allowed to charge a fee. 25% of that must go to the state, so that is really potential. It's income for the mines to pay for reclamation, it's income for the state. And
that's kind of been a real win-win-win.
It is, yeah. And I just did some back of the envelope calculations. So if we take the backfilling of the Eagle Butte mine, that would currently require around 3 billion cubic meters of material, which is much larger than if we take that 3 million tons of blade material and I convert that in a volume, that only makes 90 million cubic meters. So that mine by itself could hold about 20 times all the blade material that we expect that has to be stored by the end of 2050.
So that's a pretty good quantification.
So and you have the infrastructure, right? We just think of sending the coal trains the other way now, and collecting materials nationwide and store them at very few places. So but obviously that's kind of going forward. So that also means that the incentives for the industry to go away from landfilling are a little bit lower, right? Mm-hmm. Because it is affordable and it's doable. But nevertheless, there's quite a bit of research going forward that aims at developing blades with a more circular industry in mind. So two approaches are new thermoplastic resins. So thermoplastic would mean once we heat them up, they soften. So that would be easy. Then we can pull out the glass fiber, carbon fiber, and the resin and reuse it. Another one is actually a new bio-derived polyester resin that was also designed so that it dissolves in methanol, for example, within 6 hours. So again, you could reuse the fibers and the resin in that case. So there are strives forward to make the economy more circular, but everything that happens until we deploy those blades is quite manageable with landfilling or this backfilling idea. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so the other things, I'm going to bring two together, which would be like cost and intermittency, because the cost is really low for wind today. It has gone through the whole learning by doing curve and all these technology improvements, and certainly there's more improvements that will happen, but the cost for producing wind energy is very low, but it is intermittent. So can you talk about how that works together, and how do you think about it, wind energy going forward, maybe not at today's levels, but at much higher production of wind energy, that intermittency becomes more important than it is today. Today, we are still very much able to balance it all using even the system we have.
Sure.
So who wants to take that?
I'll take the cost initially, and then you take the intermittency. Yeah. So as you said, Holly, the cost has come down to the point where now wind energy is among the most inexpensive forms of electricity. And so as we move forward, keeping in mind electricity demands going up, that we want to keep the rates, what we pay at home, reasonable. Yeah. We want to make sure we use these lower cost types of electricity production and keep that up so our rates don't increase. So I think it's a very important part of moving forward. In terms of costs, a lot of times one of the things you hear is that, it's only cost effective because of the tax credits that you get. And while that was true 15 years ago, if you take a look at the unsubsidized cost of wind energy, land-based wind energy, it's still among the cheapest forms. So whether production tax credits or other types of tax credits are there, wind is here to stay. And that's why you have companies like GE and Siemens Gamesa that are in this game, because they see the long term that this is going to be a profitable industry.
And I think one question like specific to Wyoming around cost, I mean, wind farms or wind power plants have a big upfront cost, right? But then they have no fuel consumption over time. They might have some repairs or something like that. But here in Wyoming, our cost of wind might be cheaper than other places, right? Because those essentially they're turning and generating electricity more of the time than in other places of the country.
Yeah, exactly. So places of what we call good wind resource is both higher winds, but also the winds are blowing more often. And
all the time. Well, it's not all the time. We'll talk about that, but sometimes it feels like it.
Especially in the winter in Wyoming, it feels like it all the time. So that's represented by a number called the capacity factor. And the capacity factor is how much energy does a turbine produce compared to as if it was running 24/7, 365. And our capacity factors in Wyoming are around anywhere from the high 40s to the low 50s, which is very, very high compared to other places in the country where you might find a capacity factor for, say, a standard turbine would be more in the 30%, 35%. So that's exactly right. For the same installed cost, you're producing more electricity in a place like Wyoming. Now, that said, one of the things that's happening, the technology is getting better.
Yeah.
And so the newer turbines with, say, much larger blades can be put in regions of lower wind resource because they're bigger, they can put them up higher, and they can start to achieve maybe not the capacity factors we get in Wyoming, but much better. So that's very different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So there's more areas that are available, but still places like Wyoming are still attractive. And I would say not just because you can produce electricity here, but I think we'll talk more about this later, is that there's a general sense that we've been good in the past of basically taking our energy resources that are available and using those to make businesses out of them. And I think the same kind of consideration for wind. Wyoming's a little bit more accepting of energy development than some other places. So that makes us attractive to developers as well.
Sure.
So maybe just to add a few firm numbers, and those come from the U.S. Energy Information and Estimation, which they are known to be fairly conservative in their estimates and not really biased towards renewables. But so if we take solar standalone there, combined cycle gas, geothermal, and onshore wind are all pretty close at 4 cents per kilowatt hours. So compare that with the most advanced coal technologies, ultra supercritical coal at 8 cents per kilowatts, advanced nuclear estimated 8.8 cents per kilowatt. So there we see the difference. So in terms of numbers, that makes it pretty clear that wind is competitive. And they look at 25 different grid regions in the US, so that varies, and these numbers are averages. So obviously in some regions it's more favorable to put wind than others, but just nationwide averages,
So did you want to add anything on intermittency or?
Okay. I mean, obviously, so one solution, the simplest one, if we could do it easily, would be to add storage.
Right.
And storage could be in the form of large-scale battery storage, and that's something that's actively researched from many angles, not just from the storage side. But the other alternative is to create hydrogen. So we can take the electricity that we produce when the wind is blowing strong, and in a device called an electrolyzer, take water and split water into its molecules, hydrogen and oxygen, and then have the storage, can store the hydrogen for some time and convert it in a fuel cell, which is the opposite of the electrolyzer, or in a regular gas turbine to produce electricity when the wind is not so strong. So these are two storage solutions that are currently heavily researched. We can think of grid modernization and smart technologies to enable a more dynamic balancing of supply and demand. That's certainly important going forward. We can think of hybrid energy systems, so combining wind and solar, because, for example, it's in Wyoming we have much stronger winds in winter but much higher solar capacity in summer, right?
Yeah.
So if we combine the two, co-located, we have already a seasonal balance that looks much better. So these are also things that we can look at in the future. Then on the demand side, so demand response and flexible loads. We need large industrial consumers, for example, can time their usage that it occurs with high production of renewables. And similarly, going forward, I mean, even dishwashers will be connected to the internet.
I think some of them already are.
Mine is.
Mine's not.
So-
I need a new one too. So.
And what that enables is, it can tell the device when electricity is cheap and available, and then we run the dishwasher then. So those are certainly easy steps that we can take. And finally, expanded wind farm siting, offshore wind. So think about wind farms spread over multiple geographical regions, again, to balance seasonal and even night and day variations in the wind resource to have a more uniform supply.
I'll add just one historical note. Back early when the center was started, we worked very closely with the predecessor to the Wyoming Energy Authority, which was the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, and did many studies looking at the ability to build transmission networks that would allow transportation of energy between different sectors. So you're using these geographically different resources, wind, say, in California, wind in New Mexico, wind in Wyoming, wind in Montana. And that if you look at that resource together is a lot less intermittent than any one resource.
Yeah.
So thinking at it from a systems approach, right? It's not one source, and it's not even just wind. It's wind, solar, geothermal. Think of all the different nuclear, all these different resources working together to optimize the system. So I think with a modern grid, as Michael said, there's a lot of options that are there for addressing these intermittency issues.
Sure. And we're definitely doing some of that work here.
Yes, we are.
And with you and here at the School of Energy Resources. And, having like this great subsurface expertise at UW, at SER, and in Wyoming, like hydrogen storage, for example, there's some like real experts that could contribute to moving the needle in that area. So, okay, I have one more kind of thing to ask in the challenges sector, and that's related to bats and birds. This is something people bring up sometimes when developers are looking at siting a new wind facility and want to understand, like, what is the impact going to be to wildlife? So can you talk about the impacts, like what's the true story behind impacts to birds and bats from wind turbines, and any advances that have happened in the past or that are being worked on and now to like that could be potentially minimizing those impacts?
Sure. Like all energy infrastructure, wind has impacts on the environment. We don't want to lead to it's doesn't have any. And certainly birds and bats are among those that have, particularly in the past, been really, really struggled with how do we have less impact. So early on in the industry, we didn't really understand bird patterns around the sites we were installing wind. And there's actually wind plants that were developed in California in the 70s that turns out we did just about everything wrong in installing those plants. For instance, putting them very close to the edges of, let's say, escarpments or rapid rises in terrain. That's where thermals get created because the heating of the surface, and the birds love to ride those thermals.
Oh, yeah.
And if you put a turbine right on the edge of that, guess where that bird goes, right? And so just things like setbacks from those types of geological formations have had a huge impact on reducing deaths of those birds. So those are some easy things. Siting has gotten a lot better. I think the other thing that's exciting is even here in Wyoming, we have issues with eagles, right? And so there are new mitigation measures where they actually have detection systems that detect when eagles are in the area, and they can curtail. That means shut down the turbines to make sure that they're not going to injure the eagles. They even now look at, when you develop a wind plant, they look at wildlife patterns, including birds, and see what their patterns are, and they may choose to not install turbines in certain areas where there's corridors that birds tend to fly. Just like we drive on roads, the birds follow certain directions. So those things are going on, and birds are the main area of say that we see, particularly in Wyoming. But it doesn't mean that bats aren't important, and certainly bats other places in the country are more susceptible to impacts and even non-impact events with turbines. So that's an area of continued research of trying to understand why bats are so adversely affected. And they're continuing to do it. But same thing, they're working on systems that detect when bats are in the area, and typically it's short periods of time. in the evening, right, when the bats are really active. So trying to figure out ways to do that. But I also think like the recycling issue, you have to put it in context. Wind turbines do have a large impact on birds. I don't want to say that, and we want to make it better. But if you take a look at other places where birds suffer, skyscrapers, feral cats, they impact birds several orders of magnitudes higher than wind does. Not that we don't want to get better with wind, but just putting it in context. It's it's an issue, but we need to keep working on it, and the industry is aware of it.
Great. So let's move to more the benefits and the opportunity for the state of Wyoming. So we all know it's windy. We can't help but laugh about it when we talk about it because sometimes it's like ridiculous. And I'll say, like, when I moved here, the windows in my house, I think they're like hurricane grade or something. They actually flex, and I thought that they were going to come out. But the house had been there 10 years and they didn't come out, and they're still there today. But it is legitimate wind, especially in this part of the state. So talk about, where does Wyoming stand in terms of potential?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good one to answer. So if we look at just southeastern Wyoming, it contains 50% of the nation's highest quality wind resource. Wow. 50% of the nation. And that's obviously just the very highest potential wind resource. They call class 6 and 7 out of 7. So that's where it's most profitable to put wind turbines. So 50% of that area nationwide is in southeastern Wyoming. So that's just showing how, confirming your observation that it is windy here.
It is.
Yeah. It's good wind, right? That's good wind.
Wow.
Yeah.
And if you want to put it in a different number, NREL estimated that if we would develop Wyoming's wind resource reasonably large, it could produce about 100 times the current state's electricity demand. So, so the numbers are...
Okay, say that again. 100
times of what the current electricity demand
what we use in
Wyoming.
So we could...
Wow.
We could export a lot if we
That's
want.
a lot.
I mean, that's assuming we would develop very aggressively, which whether you want it or not, it is a different question. But just to show...
The potential
here.
Yeah. Okay, so talk about the benefits to Wyoming communities. Like all energy development, this is really important. And I think it's one of the reasons that Wyomingites, at least in our surveys, support pretty much all energy, including wind. So
and as I alluded to earlier, right, that's, I think, a real benefit of when developers look at Wyoming, they understand that Wyoming is an energy production state and they're used to it. And, a lot of parts of the country are not. They don't have these kind of infrastructures that they've done, such as mines and gas fields, that type of thing. So I think that really looks good to companies that are going to develop. So on the local cities and towns, how do they benefit? I think they benefit in actually 3 different ways that I can think of. The first one is the tax income. So when you build a wind plant, those turbines are subject to sales tax, and part of that sales tax goes back to local counties and towns as well as some of it goes to the state. And when you put in a large wind farm, the capital investment is enormous. Yeah. So these are not small numbers of tax dollars that go back. So sales tax. Also, they pay every year property tax as well. So the fact that you have a very large, expensive installation in your county means that a fair amount of income goes back. And just to give you an idea, one study showed that one large wind plant in Albany County would produce tax income, if you averaged it out over the 30-year period, that was equivalent to the Laramie City budget per year. So these are not trivial amounts of tax income. So I think that's one of them. The other one is when they're actually under construction, you have a lot of money coming into the community because there's people staying here doing construction, staying at your hotels, eating at your restaurants, spending money in town. So that's the short-term benefit. And then the longer-term benefit is that you've got typically a large wind farm will have anywhere from 10 to 20 full-time employees. And these are well-paid people, again, that settle typically in your communities and bring in good jobs, and their kids are in the school system. So I think that's another really huge benefit to Wyoming. Yeah,
I think a couple points we can validate that. So the Chokecherry Sierra Madre facility is under construction. It's the largest onshore wind facility in the U.S., I believe. And I think that Carbon County, where it is mostly located, was one of the only counties that saw its revenue increase during COVID.
Right.
And that was because of the facility.
Exactly.
So, and they hire UW grads, by the way.
There you go.
So,
and I would say they're not alone. I think also if you take a look at Laramie County, they have also had they've really benefited from the wind plants that are in Laramie County, contributing to their finances.
So is there any misconceptions that we haven't talked about wind or benefits that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share?
Well, I think, one of the things that I get most concerned about is I really want local communities to make decisions on whether they want to have wind based on the kind of things we've talked. We've talked about benefits. We've talked about liabilities. I think the thing that frustrates me is that a lot of times there's, these issues are brought up like, oh, we're going to fill up the Laramie dump with our wind turbine blades, or, we're going to dump a bunch of toxic substances on the ground if these turbines light on fire. And as you see, generally there's pictures of turbines burning that you can Google on YouTube. And it's not that these things don't happen, but typically the impact is very limited to a local area. You can clean it up. So all these kind of things where, I don't want to mitigate or I don't want to trivialize things like viewscapes and things like that, but having a discussion about the real issues, what are the real liabilities and what are the real benefits?
Right.
And here in Albany County, we've had a lot of discussion of this over the last 4 or 5 years, and we've decided to move ahead on several wind plants because on the balance, we feel like it's a benefit to the local economy, schools, fire, police, all those things that local tax revenue supports that are important to counties and towns. So that's my main thing is I want to have good sources of information about birds, about wildlife impacts, rather than, kind of things that seem that they come out of the ether that are not really real or they're exaggerated.
Yeah. With one of the local facilities that was when it was being proposed, certainly everyone in town, including me, I got a little flyer that misrepresented what the impacts to the views in Laramie. And I think that everyone's busy and it's tough, but it's incumbent on all of us when an energy project of any type is proposed in and around your community, they have to go through a siting process. And that's the time to learn the truth about like, where is this going to be? What are the potential impacts, both positive and negative? And
open houses, right?
Yeah.
And typically the people that show up at the open houses are the people that oppose the projects.
That's true.
And it's really good to have people come out that are actually supportive or at least neutral and want to learn something.
Yeah.
It's a real opportunity in a short amount of time to learn what the benefits are and as well as the liabilities.
I think it's really unfair to those of us with school-age children because we have the most of benefit, honestly, from that tax revenue, but then there is some kind of sport every night. So I don't know if there's some societal solution to that, but
yeah, I think it's important though. My kids are growing up and they benefited from their education in Wyoming, but at the same point, I feel very strongly that we need to support, schools and local economies. We raised our kids here and benefited from it. Yeah. And I want your kids and the future kids, I want my kids to have the option to settle here and raise their kids as well. And again, making good decisions based on these large infrastructure projects is important to the future of the state.
Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think also project developers are learning on how to prepare that and get better at community engagement and
early
consensus-based decision making. They take notes from the work that's done here at the Hauptschule for Environment and Natural Resources, also work that you do at SCR to kind of hone in on some of the techniques and things and best practices that can be done to make these meetings and processes more efficient and include a larger group of the stakeholders.
I totally agree with that. I don't think any project developer today should ever take for granted. I mean, this is a large industrial siting.
Exactly.
People, you can't just say, okay, people love wind energy. This is our community. You got to talk about the specifics to our community. And I've seen a couple stumbles on that. And hopefully, I think we want to be helpful. And I think it's really improved over the last few years, though. So.
Michael brought up a lot of the hurdles and challenges of wind going forward. And I think these social aspects, right, of acceptance and is really one of the areas that the Department of Energy is starting to recognize needs to be addressed better. Again, get the good information into people's hands and let them make good decisions based on good information.
It's well said. Okay, I just have to ask, do either of you know what happened to that wind turbine on I-80 that was super dysphoric. Did it get hit by lightning?
Yes, it did.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, just wanted to fact check that with experts who clearly don't.
And just to say that not every time a turbine gets hit by lightning does a blade disintegrate like that.
That was crazy.
Right?
It bit in half.
Well, it basically delaminated the fiberglass that was in there. They actually have lightning protection systems, and they many times will survive, but certain times they get hit certain ways where the lightning protection system is kind of bypassed, and that's when you see extreme results like that. But as you see, it's back up and operating.
It's back up and operating, yeah. I've never seen anything like it, but it was just like a topic of discussion for everyone going back and forth.
Absolutely, and it sat there for a couple of weeks too, right? So.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation. For our last question, we always ask our guests a little bit different question, and it is, where is your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
Oh, that's a hard one. There's so many.
I know.
So I do like to go camping in spring to Glendale when it's not so hot yet. And, you're getting out of Laramie, you can already experience spring there.
So by spring, you in Laramie, that's July.
Yeah. So I mean, May. Okay, so when we still have winter, right? You go to Glendale and you get to enjoy summer for our taste. So I do like going to Glendale, but I also like just what's around us here, Happy Jack and the Medbo. So
great.
Yeah, we're pretty spoiled locally, and hunting and fishing and all those kind of things that you can do locally. So I spend a lot of time in the outdoors here locally. But if I have to travel sometimes, we've spent about the last decade spending a week in the backcountry in Yellowstone, which is possibly colder than Laramie and thaws out later. But by mid-July, it's pretty nice, and it's also packed, as you know, with lots of cars. But if you get into the backcountry, it can be a really pleasant experience that time of year.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for all you do for the University of Wyoming, for the School of Energy Resources, for the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences, for your students, and thank you for doing this podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.